The wind possessed a malice that felt personal, a living thing with teeth that chewed at the leather of the saddle and sought the warmth of the man sitting in it. It was Christmas Eve in the high country where the territories of Wyoming and Montana bled into one another, a border drawn on paper that meant nothing to the blizzard gathering its strength in the north. Elias sat atop his bay mare, his chin tucked deep into the collar of a sheepskin coat that had seen better years. The land around him was a vast, rolling ocean of white and gray, the sagebrush reduced to skeletal fingers poking through the drifts. He was checking the fence line, a task that felt futile in this weather. But the routine was the only thing that kept the silence from becoming deafening. The wire hummed in the gale, a high, mournful note that vibrated in his teeth. He rode slowly, his eyes narrowed against the stinging grit of ice crystals. He checked the water troughs, breaking the layer of ice on the surface with the heel of his boot so the few head of cattle huddled in the lee of the ridge could drink. They looked at him with wet, miserable eyes, their breath pluming in the gray air. Elias touched the brim of his hat to them. They were the only company he had that did not judge him. His cabin sat in the distance, a dark bruise against the snow. It was a sturdy structure, built of logs felled by his own hands, but it was small and drafty. Inside, he knew what waited for him. A single tin plate set on a rough-hewn table, a pot of beans that had been simmering too long, and the silence. The silence was the loudest thing in the room. There was a Bible on the shelf near the stove, the leather cover worn smooth by fingers that were not his. Inside, written in a delicate, looping hand, was the name Martha. It was not his name, and she was not there to read it. Beneath the Bible, hidden in a wooden box meant for cartridges, lay a photograph so faded that the faces were merely ghosts of silver and shadow. He never looked at it. He did not need to. The memory was etched into the back of his eyelids, clearer than the landscape before him. Elias turned the mare back toward the cabin, the cold settling deep in his bad leg, the one that ached whenever the sky turned leaden. He was a man of 35 winters, but his face carried the map of 50. A jagged scar ran from his hairline down through his left eyebrow, vanishing into the beard that covered his jaw. It was a mark of violence, a signature of the life he had left behind but could not outrun. Earlier that day, the isolation had been broken, though not by kindness. He had ridden into town, a settlement of false-fronted buildings clinging to the railroad tracks, to buy the few staples he needed to survive the coming storms: flour, coffee, salt, and a small pouch of tobacco. The general store had been warm, smelling of sawdust, pickled eggs, and damp wool. A stove glowed cherry red in the center of the room, surrounded by men who had nothing better to do than talk. When Elias opened the door, the bell chimed, and the talking stopped. It did not taper off. It was severed, as if he had cut the throat of the conversation. He walked to the counter, his spurs chiming softly on the floorboards. The clerk was new, a young man with pimples and a nervous Adam's apple. He looked at Elias, at the scar, at the dark, weathered skin that spoke of blood that was not entirely white, and he swallowed hard. "Coffee and flour," Elias said, his voice a rusted hinge. The boy scrambled to fill the order, his hands shaking as he weighed the goods. Behind Elias, the whispers began. They were like the scratching of mice in the walls. "That is him," a voice murmured. "The one who lives out past the creek. Don't look him in the eye," another warned. "My PA says he is untouchable. Says he killed a man in Abilene just for looking at his boots wrong. He wasn't born pure, that is for sure." A third voice hissed. "Look at him. Mongrel blood. Danger in him." Elias placed a silver dollar on the counter. He did not turn around. He did not acknowledge them. He had learned long ago that words were like wind. They only had force if you stood against them. If you let them pass through you, they could not knock you down. But the clerk flinched when Elias's fingers brushed the wood of the counter, pulling his hand back as if Elias carried a plague. "Merry Christmas," the clerk squeaked, the words sounding terrified. Elias gathered his sack. "There is no mercy in the winter," he said softly, more to himself than the boy, and walked out into the cold. That same afternoon, the iron horse screamed its arrival at the station, belching black smoke into the pristine sky. The train was late, delayed by the drifts in the pass, and the passengers who disembarked were stiff and sour-faced. Sina stepped down from the carriage, and the air on the platform seemed to shift. She was immense. There was no other word for it. In a time when women were expected to be petite, fragile things that could be tucked under a man's arm, Sina was a fortress. She stood over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that could pull a plow and hips that promised strength rather than softness. She wore a thick woolen coat that had been patched at the elbows and a scarf wrapped tight around her head, but they could not hide the sheer scale of her. She gripped her travel trunk with a hand that was large and red from work, her knuckles white. She was 22 years old, born in a fjord where the mountains fell into the sea, but here, on this wooden platform in America, she felt like a monster. The crowd at the station, waiting for mail or relatives, fell silent just as the men in the store had. But this silence was different. It was not fearful. It was mocking. "Look at the size of her," a woman whispered loudly, hiding her mouth behind a gloved hand. "Is it a man in a dress?" a child asked, pointing a mittened finger. "Hush," the mother scolded, but she was smiling. "It is a giant. Surely, a giantess from the storybooks." Sina kept her eyes on the slushy planks of the platform. She understood enough English to know the tone of ridicule. It was a universal language. She had heard it in the port of New York and on the train across the plains. Big, ox, giant, freak. She stood freezing, the wind whipping her skirts, waiting for the man who held her fate in his pocket. She had come as a mail-order bride, a transaction born of desperation. Her father was dead, the farm sold to pay debts, and the letters from Mr. Caldwell had promised a good life, a warm home, and respect. "There she is!" The voice was booming, filled with a possessive pride that made Sina's stomach turn. Silas Caldwell pushed through the crowd. He was a merchant, a man in his 40s with a stomach that strained the buttons of his vest and a mustache that he waxed into sharp points. He owned the dry goods store, the livery, and half the debt in the county. He stopped in front of her, looking her up and down, not at her face, but at her body, the way a man inspects a horse at an auction. He circled her, nodding to himself. "That is the best stock I ever ordered," Caldwell announced to the gawking crowd, waving a piece of paper. "Look at the breadth of her. She will last through the winter, won't she?" The men around him chuckled. Sina felt the heat rise in her cheeks, burning despite the biting cold. She clutched her trunk tighter. "Mr. Caldwell?" she asked, her voice trembling. He clapped a hand on her shoulder, his grip hard. "That is right, darling. I paid the passage, and here you are. A lot of woman for the money." He did not offer to carry her trunk. He simply turned and began to walk toward the large, painted house at the end of the street, expecting her to follow. She hoisted the heavy wooden box, the weight of it familiar and grounding, and trailed behind him, her boots crunching in the snow, the laughter of the town following her like a pack of dogs. Caldwell's house was warm, stiflingly so. It smelled of cigar smoke and stale potpourri. He led her into the parlor and poured himself a drink from a crystal decanter, not offering her even a glass of water. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to a delicate chair. Sina remained standing. She was afraid the chair would snap under her. "I stand," she said, her English thick and slow. Caldwell laughed, tossing back the amber liquid. "Suit yourself. Now, listen here. This is the contract." He slapped the paper on the table. "It says I am the husband, and you are the wife. But let us be clear on what that means. I did not bring you here to sit in the parlor and drink tea with the ladies. They would not have you anyway. You are too big for teacups." He walked closer, the smell of whiskey sour on his breath. "I need someone strong, someone to haul the barrels in the store, someone to move the crates. You are built for labor, not for dancing. You are a curiosity. Sina, I will put you in the front of the shop. People will come just to see the giant bride. It will be good for business." Sina felt a coldness spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the winter outside. She had hoped for a partner. She had hoped for safety. Instead, she had been purchased as a beast of burden and a sideshow attraction. "Work is good," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I work hard, but I am wife, not animal." Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "You are what I say you are. The contract gives me rights. To your labor, to your money, if you have any, and to your body." He took another step, his eyes dropping to her chest. "It is Christmas Eve," he said, his voice dropping to a slur. "And I think I should get my money's worth before the preacher says his words tomorrow. A man likes to test the merchandise." Sina stepped back, bumping into a side table. "No, we wait. For church." Caldwell lunged. He was not a large man, but he was heavy and fueled by drink. He grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Don't you tell me no, you great lumbering cow! I bought you!" He yanked her toward him, his other hand fumbling at the buttons of her coat. Sina panicked. The memory of the rough hands of sailors on the crossing flashed in her mind, the fear she had lived with for months. She did not think, she reacted. She shoved him, because she had spent her life lifting stones from the fields and hauling nets from the sea. The shove was more powerful than she intended. Caldwell flew backward. He struck a heavy oak table with a sickening crack and crumpled to the floor, groaning, clutching his side. Sina stared at him, horror washing over her. She had hurt a prominent man, a man who owned the town. They would hang her, or worse. She grabbed her coat, pulling it tight. She did not look back for her trunk. She did not look for her hat. She turned and ran out the door, into the biting wind, into the darkness that had fallen while she was inside. She ran blindly. The town was a blur of yellow windows and barking dogs. She kept running until the lights faded, until there was only the road and the snow and the terrible, howling blackness of the prairie. The storm had fully descended. The snow was no longer falling. It was being driven horizontally, like needles. Sina trudged off the main road, thinking she heard hoofbeats behind her, thinking Caldwell was coming. She plunged into the deep snow of the open range. Her boots, cheap leather things made for a city she had never seen, filled with ice. Her skirt, wet from the drifts, froze into a heavy bell that battered her legs with every step. She walked for an hour, then 2. The cold stopped hurting and started burning. And then, terrifyingly, it stopped burning and started to feel like nothing at all. Her legs, those long, strong limbs that had always been her shame and her strength, began to fail. She stumbled, got up, stumbled again. The wind screamed in her ears, drowning out her own ragged breathing. "Please," she whispered in Norwegian. "God, please." But the sky was empty, and the earth was hard. She fell against a fence post, the wood rough against her cheek. She curled into a ball, trying to preserve the last spark of heat in her core. The snow began to pile over her, a white blanket tucking her in for a sleep from which she would not wake. Elias was heading home, the mare fighting the bit, eager for the barn. He kept his head down, navigating by the tension of the wire fence on his right and the lay of the land he knew by heart. He almost missed her. The drifts were playing tricks on his eyes, creating shapes that vanished when he looked directly at them. But there was a shape by the section corner that did not move with the wind, a dark mound, partially buried. He pulled the mare up. Whoa! He squinted. It looked like a calf that had strayed, or perhaps a dead deer, but the shape was wrong. He dismounted, his boots sinking deep, and waded toward the fence. When he brushed the snow away, he saw the fabric of a coat, blue wool. He dug faster, his heart hammering a sudden warning rhythm against his ribs. He uncovered a shoulder, then a face, pale as the moon, framed by frozen blonde hair. A woman. Elias stared, his mind struggling to process the impossible sight. A woman, out here, 5 miles from town, in the teeth of a blizzard on Christmas Eve. She was curled tight, her eyes closed, her lips a terrifying shade of blue. He touched her cheek. It was like touching marble. "Miss," he shouted over the wind. "Can you hear me?" She mumbled something. A sound that was not English, a low groan of delirium. Elias knew he had minutes, perhaps less. He had to get her off the ground. He bent to lift her, bracing himself. He was a strong man, accustomed to hoisting saddles and hay bales, but when he pulled her into his arms, he grunted with the effort. She was immense, long-limbed and heavy with bone and muscle, made heavier by the weight of her frozen, sodden clothes. He staggered, his bad leg protesting, but he managed to haul her upright. "Good Lord," he muttered, the wind stealing the words. He dragged her to the mare. Getting her into the saddle was a battle. The horse shied, smelling the distress, but Elias spoke sharply, calming the beast. He had to use all his strength to push the woman up, draping her across the saddlebow like a sack of grain because she was too far gone to sit. He unbuttoned his sheepskin coat and draped it over her back, leaving himself exposed to the biting wind in just his flannel shirt and vest. He climbed up behind her, shoving his boots into the stirrups, wrapping his arms around her massive frame to hold her steady. He spurred the mare. "Yeah, go on, girl, go!" The ride to the cabin was a blur of misery. The wind cut through Elias's shirt like a knife, freezing the sweat on his skin. He could feel the woman's coldness seeping into him. A block of ice pressed against his chest. He kept one hand pressed to her back, feeling for the faint, thready beat of her heart. She was so big. The thought kept circling in his mind. Who was she? Why was she here? It was as if the storm had birthed her. A giantess of ice and snow dropped onto his land to test him. The cabin appeared. A flicker of lantern light he had left burning in the window. A habit from the days when he hoped someone might come home. He practically fell off the horse at the door, dragging the woman down with him. He kicked the door open and carried her inside, the warmth of the room hitting him like a physical blow. He laid her on his narrow bed. The mattress groaned under her weight. Elias moved with the frantic efficiency of a soldier field dressing a wound. He threw wood into the stove, opening the damper wide until the fire roared. Then he turned back to her. She was shaking now, violent, racking tremors that shook the entire bed frame. That was good. Shaking meant life. Her clothes were frozen solid. The hem of her dress was a board of ice. If he left them on, she would die of hypothermia or lose her limbs to frostbite. He had to get them off. He hesitated, his hands hovering over her. He was a man who lived alone. He was a man who had not touched a woman in gentleness for 10 years. Propriety screamed at him to stop, to avert his eyes. Survival screamed louder. "Forgive me, ma'am," he whispered. He worked quickly, his fingers clumsy with cold. He unbuttoned the coat, peeling the stiff wool away. He unlaced the bodice of her dress, the fabric tearing in his haste. He stripped the wet layers down, trying to keep his eyes fixed on the task, the buttons, the laces, the fabric, and not on the skin beneath. He pulled the dress down her legs, revealing thick wool stockings soaked through with meltwater. He grabbed the heel of her left boot and wrenched it off. Then the right. He reached to pull the stockings down, his hand brushing the inside of her thigh. His fingers struck something hard. It was not bone. It was not flesh. It was a solid, distinct ridge beneath the wool. Elias paused. He carefully rolled the stocking down just past the knee. Tied there, with a strip of leather against the pale, powerful muscle of her inner thigh, was a knife. It was a small blade, simple and sharp, the kind a fisherman might use to gut a catch. It was pressed intimately against her skin, hidden where no one would look, unless they were taking liberties. Elias stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. He looked at the woman, this giant stranger who had walked into the white void rather than submit to whatever she had run from. He pulled the knife free, holding it up in the firelight. It glinted, sharp and deadly. "What is between your legs?" "Girl," he muttered, the words slipping out in a mixture of shock and reluctant admiration. "Steel? On the bed." The woman gasped. Her eyes flew open. They were blue, pale as the ice on the trough, and filled with a sudden, lucid terror. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the log wall, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Her teeth chattered violently, but her gaze was locked on the knife in his hand. Elias froze. He realized how he must look, a scarred, bearded stranger looming over her half-naked body, holding her own weapon. He slowly turned the handle and offered it to her, hilt first. He stepped back, raising his empty hands, his palms open to the firelight. "I am not going to hurt you," he said, his voice rough with the cold. "You are freezing. I had to. The clothes were wet." She stared at him, her chest heaving. She looked at the knife, then at his face. She saw the scar. She saw the large, calloused hands held away from her body. She saw the pile of wet clothes on the floor and understood the shame of her position. But she also saw the fire he had built up. She saw the coat he had wrapped around her. She reached out a trembling hand and took the knife. She did not attack. She slid it under the pillow, her eyes never leaving his. "Steal," she whispered, the English word clumsy on her frozen tongue. "Yes, steal." Elias nodded once, sharply. He grabbed a blanket from the chair and turned his back to her, giving her the only privacy the single room afforded. "Rest," he said to the wall. "The storm is not done with us yet." Outside, the wind howled like a lost soul, burying the cabin, the fences, and the world in white, sealing them in together. The light that filled the cabin was not the golden promise of morning, but a flat, suffocating white. It pressed against the single pane of glass in the south wall, a blind eye staring into nothingness. The world outside had vanished, the horizon, the fence lines, the distant silhouette of the mountains. All of it had been erased by the storm, replaced by a silence so profound it made the blood hum in the ears. There were no church bells. In the town 5 miles away, the iron clapper might be swinging in the steeple, marking the birth of Christ. But out here, there was only the wind. It did not howl anymore. It droned, a low, constant vibration that shuddered through the timber walls and rattled the tin chimney pipe. Sina woke slowly, surfacing from a dark, heavy sleep that felt more like drowning than resting. Her body was a map of aches. Her shoulders throbbed from the cold. Her legs felt heavy as lead, and her head spun with the disorientation of a fever. She blinked, staring up at a rough-hewn ceiling beam where a spider web trembled in the draft. This was not the merchant's house. This was not the ship. Memory returned in jagged shards. The contract, the whiskey on Caldwell's breath, the bite of the snow, the man on the horse. She shifted, and the realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was warm. She was covered by a heavy quilt that smelled of tobacco and sage. But beneath it, her legs were bare. Sina sat up with a gasp, clutching the quilt to her chin. The movement made the bed frame groan, a sound that seemed deafening in the small room. She looked down. She was wearing her chemise and her petticoats, but her heavy wool dress, her stockings, and her boots were gone. Her legs, long and pale and terrifyingly exposed, dangled near the edge of the mattress. Shame, hot and prickly, flushed her skin. She pulled her knees up, trying to make herself small, an impossible task for a woman who had been told since she was 12 that she took up too much room in the world. A sound from the corner made her freeze. Elias was sitting in a wooden chair near the cast-iron stove, whittling a piece of kindling with a pocket knife. He stopped when she moved, his hand hovering in the air. He did not look at her. His gaze was fixed resolutely on the iron door of the stove, where the fire snapped and popped. "Good morning," he said. His voice was gravel, low and scraping, as if he had not used it for days. Sina swallowed, her throat dry as dust. My clothes, they are drying," Elias said, pointing with the knife toward a line of rope strung above the stove. Her blue wool dress hung there, stiff and misshapen, steaming slightly in the heat. Her stockings were draped over the back of a chair. "You were frozen," he continued, his words halting, carefully chosen. "The ice. It was in the fabric. If I left them on, the fever would have taken you. Or the frost." He still did not look at her. His posture was rigid, his shoulders hunched forward as if he were waiting for a blow. Sina watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the tension in his back, the way he kept his large hands in plain sight, away from his body. He was terrifying to look at. The scar, the dark beard, the sheer rough presence of him. But his body language was not that of a conqueror. It was that of a man trying to make himself disappear. He had undressed her. The thought made her face burn. He had seen the size of her, the endless length of bone and muscle that the townspeople mocked. But he was sitting across the room, putting as much distance between them as the small cabin allowed. "You saved me," she said. Her English was slow, the vowels round and heavy with her mother tongue. Elias finally turned his head, though he kept his eyes on the floor near the bed. "I found you. That is all." He stood up, and the cabin suddenly felt very small. He walked to the stove, poured a cup of coffee from a battered blue pot, and set it on the table within her reach. Then he retreated to the window, staring at the wall of snow. "Drink," he said. "It is black. I have no sugar." Sina reached for the cup, the quilt slipping slightly from her shoulder. She adjusted it quickly. "Thank you." The coffee was bitter and thick, scalded on the iron, but the heat of it spread through her chest, chasing away the lingering chill of the drift. She watched him. "I am Signa," she said. "Sina Larsdatter." He nodded at the snow. "Elias, Elias," she repeated, testing the name. It sounded like the wind in the dry grass. He turned then, looking at her properly for the first time since she woke. His eyes were dark, shadowed by the brim of the hat he had not taken off. "Your feet," he said abruptly. "We need to see to your feet." Sina instinctively pulled her legs further under the quilt. "They are fine. They are not fine," Elias said. He walked to the stove and lifted a kettle. He poured steaming water into a tin basin, then added a dipper of cold water from a bucket near the door, testing the temperature with his elbow like a woman bathing a child. He brought the basin to the side of the bed and set it on the floor. Then he knelt. The motion was stiff. She saw him wince as his left leg bent. "Put them in," he ordered gently. Sina hesitated. To do so, she would have to uncover her legs again. She would have to present her feet, large, broad, callous-skinned from a lifetime of walking rocky fields, to this stranger. But the throbbing in her toes was becoming an agony she could not ignore. Slowly, she extended her legs. Letting the quilt fall to her knees, she lowered her feet into the water. She hissed through her teeth as the blood began to rush back into the frozen vessels. It was a stinging, burning pain, sharper than the cold had been. "I know," Elias murmured. He reached into the water. Sina flinched, pulling back. "Easy," he said, his hands stopping in the water. "I have to rub them. If the blood does not move, the flesh dies." He waited for her nod before he touched her. His hands were rough, the palms like sandpaper, the fingers scarred and thick, but his touch was startlingly light. He took her left foot in his hands and began to massage the heel, the arch, the toes. He worked with a rhythmic, practical concentration, his head bent low. Sina stared at the top of his hat. This was intimate, more intimate, in a way, than what Caldwell had tried to do. Caldwell had wanted to take, Elias was trying to restore. "You have big hands," she said, grasping for words to fill the silence. Elias paused, looking at her foot in his grip. It was nearly as long as his forearm. He did not laugh. "Matches yours," he said softly. He continued rubbing. Sina felt the shame recede, replaced by a strange, quiet wonder. He was not looking at her size with disgust. He was looking at it as a fact, like the depth of the snow or the heat of the stove. "Where do you come from?" "Sina," he asked, keeping his eyes on his work. "Norway," she said, "the valley of Gudbrandsdal." "It is mountains, snow like this, but the sea is near. Why come here?" She sighed, the sound heavy in the room. "My father died. The farm went to the bank. People, they laugh at me there, too. They say Sina is too big for a wife. Sina is good for pulling the plow, but not for the house." She watched his thumbs work over a spot of white frost nip on her little toe. "I have a brother," she added quietly. "Younger. He was small, beautiful. But the winter took him. The sea took him. I was the strong one. I should have saved him. But I could not." Elias stopped rubbing for a moment. He looked up, and his eyes met hers. There was no pity in them, only a dark recognition. "The winter takes who it wants," he said. "Strength has nothing to do with it." He dried her feet with a rough towel, his movements efficient, then stood and emptied the basin into the slop bucket. "And you?" Sina asked, tucking her feet back into the warmth. "You are alone here." Elias moved back to his chair. The distance reestablished. "I am alone because it is safer. For everyone." He picked up his piece of wood again, the knife slicing a curl of pine. "My father built this cabin," he said. "He was a cattleman. A range war started. Barbed wire against open grass. He was shot 3 years ago, right where the fence line meets the creek. And your mother died when I was a boy. Fever. So you are the rancher now," she said. Elias stopped whittling. He looked at the faded photograph box on the shelf. "Then away. I was a rancher. Then I was a soldier for a time. Then I rode with men I should not have ridden with." He turned the knife in his hand, the blade catching the dull light. "There was a fight in a town called Abilene. A man drew on me. I put him in the ground. It was fair, by the law. But the town, folks don't forget blood. They say I have a devil in me. They say I bring death." He looked at her, his expression bleak. "That is why the clerk at the store would not touch my hand. That is why I live where the road ends. You are safe here, seen from the storm, but you are in the house of a man with no name worth having." Sina looked at him, the scar, the haunted eyes, the gentle hands that had just saved her feet. "The devil does not rub feet with warm water," she said firmly. Elias stared at her, then gave a short, dry huff of breath that might have been a laugh. "No, I suppose he does not." The day passed in a slow, gray blur. The storm did not break. It intensified. The wind battered the north wall, piling snow so high against the logs that the cabin felt like a ship submerged in a wide ocean. They were trapped. The space, which was enough for one solitary man, became incredibly small with two. It was a dance of avoidance. Elias heated a stew of venison and beans on the stove. They ate in silence, the only sound the scraping of spoons on tin. The bread was days old, hard as stone, and they had to soften it in the gravy. When Sina rose to take the plates to the bucket, she misjudged the space. She turned, and her shoulder brushed hard against Elias's arm as he stood near the wash basin. He jerked back as if burned, pressing himself against the shelves. "Sorry," she murmured, pulling her arms in. It is fine," he stammered. "Later." She tried to help him stack the firewood he had brought in before the storm. She reached for a log on the upper pile, and her head cracked against a low-hanging roof beam. Bang! She stumbled back, clutching her forehead. Elias dropped the wood he was holding and stepped forward, his hand raising instinctively to help her, then stopping in midair. "Are you hurt?" Sina rubbed her head. She looked at the beam, then at her own long legs, then at Elias's worried face. A bubble of laughter rose in her chest, not hysterical, but genuine, deep and surprised. "I am too tall for your house." "Elias," she chuckled, the sound rich and warm. "Even the wood fights me." Elias watched her. He had expected tears. He had expected anger. He had not expected this, a woman who could crack her head on a beam and laugh about it. The sound transformed her face. The lines of strain around her eyes vanished. She looked young and strong and alive. He felt a strange tightening in his chest. It was not the tightness of fear. "The house is too low," he corrected quietly. "You are just right." The words hung in the air, fragile as smoke. Sina stopped laughing. She looked at him, her hand slowly lowering from her head, for a moment, across the dusty air of the cabin. Something passed between them, a recognition that they were both too large, too scarred, too much for the world outside. But perhaps, in here, they fit. Night fell early, or perhaps the day just gave up. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted as the fire burned down to coals. The wind found every crack in the chinking, sending icy fingers of air drifting across the floor. Elias stood by the bed, looking at the floorboards. "You take the bed," he said. "I will sleep here, by the fire." Sina looked at the floor. It was rough planks, drafty and cold. Even with a blanket, the chill would seep into the bone. "No," she said. "You will freeze. The floor is ice. I am used to it. You are a man, not a stone," she argued. She looked at the bed. It was a narrow rope-frame cot, barely wide enough for one, let alone two people of their size. But the cold was a living enemy in the room. "We share," she said, her voice dropping. Elias looked at her, alarmed. "Sina, I cannot. That is not proper. Proper is for people who are warm," she said, practicality winning over her shyness. "We turned backs, back to back. Plenty of space." She lay down on the bed, scooting all the way to the log wall, pulling her knees up. She pulled the quilt over her, leaving half of it empty. "Come," she said, "or you die on the floor, and I have to drag you out in spring." Elias hesitated for a long time. He looked at the floor, then at the empty sliver of mattress. He blew out the lantern, plunging the room into darkness save for the red glow of the stove vent. He sat on the edge of the bed. He removed his boots, setting them softly on the wood. Then, keeping his trousers and flannel shirt buttoned to the neck, he lay down. He lay on the absolute edge, his body rigid, every muscle tense. He could feel the mattress dip under their combined weight. Sina lay facing the wall, her eyes wide open in the dark. She felt the bed shift. She felt the sudden, radiating heat of him. He was like a furnace. For a long time, neither moved. Then, the cold forced the issue. Elias shivered, an involuntary tremor. Sina shifted backward, just an inch, her back pressed against his. The contact was electric. Through the layers of wool and flannel, she could feel the solid line of his spine, the breadth of his shoulders. She could feel the rhythm of his breathing, steady and slow. Elias stared into the dark. He could feel the length of her legs against the back of his thighs. He could smell the scent of her, not perfume, but something cleaner, wood smoke, cold air, and the faint, salty tang of damp wool. It was the smell of survival. He closed his eyes, his hand resting on his chest. He was terrified to move, terrified to offend her, yet for the first time in 10 years, the hollow ache of loneliness that lived in his gut was silent. The blizzard did not lift the next day, nor the day after. Time became fluid, measured only by the feeding of the stove and the lighting of the lantern. The confinement forced a domesticity upon them that was both awkward and tender. They developed a rhythm. Elias woke first to stoke the fire. Sina cooked the meal, learning to manage the temperamental stove. On the third afternoon, Sina sat at the table, her large hands holding a needle and thread she had found in a tin. She was mending one of Elias's socks, the heel worn through to a gaping hole. Elias sat opposite her, cleaning his rifle. He watched her work, the needle flashing in the lantern light. "You do not have to do that," he said. "I cannot sit and do nothing." She replied without looking up. "And your feet will freeze in these." She bit the thread. A sharp snap. "What is this in English?" she asked, holding up the sock. "Sock," he said. "Sock," she repeated. "Same. And this?" She tapped the table. "Table." She pointed to the stove. "Stove." She pointed to him. Elias paused. A broken man. He wanted to say, "Elias," he said simply. She smiled. A small, private thing. "Elias and me, Sina." She finished the knot and set the sock down. Then, with a mischievous glint in her eye that surprised even her, she lifted her skirt just an inch, pointing to the spot above her knee where the leather sheath still rested. "And this?" she asked. Elias felt the heat rise in his neck. He remembered the moment he had found the blade, the shock of it. "That is a surprise," he said, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth beneath his beard. She laughed. "It is my, how do you say, insurance? Protection," he corrected. "Protection. Yes." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "So, that is what you keep between your legs. Your last word against any man." Sina flushed pink, but she did not look away. She held his gaze, her chin lifting slightly. "When you are big, Men think they can take. They think I am land, to be claimed. The knife says no. The knife says I belong to me." Elias looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the steel in her spine that matched the steel in her stocking. "It is a good word," he said softly. It was a night deep in the belly of the storm when the walls finally came down. The wind was screaming outside, a banshee wail that made the cabin feel like the last shelter on earth. They sat in the chairs, pulled close to the open door of the stove, watching the flames lick the oak logs. Sina had been quiet all evening. She held her tin cup in both hands, staring into the fire. "He called me livestock," she said suddenly. The silence broke like a dry twig. Elias did not have to ask who she meant. He looked at the fire, his jaw tightening until the muscle jumped. "Caldwell," he stated. She nodded. "He looked at my teeth. He looked at my hips. He told me I would breed strong sons for labor. He did not ask my name. He did not ask if I liked music, or if I missed the sea. He just checked the contract." Elias gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. The anger that rose in him was old and familiar, a black oil in his blood. But this time, it was not for himself. "He is a small man," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. "A man with a ledger for a heart." Sina turned to look at him. The firelight cast deep shadows across his face, highlighting the jagged scar that ran through his eye. "And you?" she asked. "Who hurt you?" "Elias." He stiffened. It was the question no one asked. The townspeople whispered it, but no one asked. She reached out, her hand hovering near his face but not touching. "You have scars, not just this one." She gestured to his face. "I see how you walk. I see how you look at the door. Did anyone ever see your pain, or did they just see the gun?" The question stripped him bare. Elias opened his mouth to deflect, to give the standard answer about the war or the feud. But looking into her face, open, honest, and waiting, the lie died in his throat. He looked down at his hands. "No," he whispered. "No one saw." He took a shaky breath. "My father, he was a hard man. He taught me that pain is a weakness. When he died, I didn't cry. I just rode. I rode until I found men who were angry like me. We did bad things. Sina. We took things that weren't ours." He looked up at her, his eyes wet. "When I killed that man in Abilene, I didn't feel glory. I didn't feel justice. I felt tired. Just tired. I came back here to be a ghost, to let the world forget me." Sina leaned forward. She closed the distance between them. She placed her large, warm hand over his clenched fist on the arm of the chair. "You are not a ghost. Elias," he looked at her hand covering his. It was heavy and solid. "You are the man who pulled me from the snow," she said, fierce and low. "You are the man who rubbed life back into my feet. You are the man who gave me his bed and slept on the floor." She squeezed his hand. "Caldwell saw a horse. I see a man, a good man." Elias stared at her, his breath hitched in his chest. The wind howled outside, trying to tear the roof off, but in that small circle of firelight, the world stopped. He turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers. Her palm was rough, calloused like his, and it fit against his skin perfectly. "Thank you," he choked out. They sat there for a long time, hands clasped, listening to the storm rage against the walls, neither of them alone for the first time in years. The silence that followed the storm was heavier than the wind had been. It lay over the valley like a thick wool blanket, muffling the world. For 3 days, the sky had been a churning wall of gray, but when the sun finally broke the horizon on the 4th morning, it illuminated a landscape transformed. The fences were gone, swallowed by drifts that rolled like frozen waves. The sagebrush was buried. The only thing that marked the boundary between earth and sky was the blinding, diamond-hard glitter of the snow crust. Elias stood on the porch of the cabin, shielding his eyes against the glare. The air was so cold it felt solid in his lungs, sharpening his senses. He knew he had to move. The storm had sealed them in, but it would not keep the world out forever. "We have to go," he said. his voice rough in the quiet air. Sina stood in the doorway behind him, wrapped in her coat, her breath pluming before her face. "Go? Where?" "Town," Elias replied. He did not turn to look at her. He was watching the distant ridge, where the road usually lay. "We need feed for the stock, and I need to speak to the sheriff before Caldwell does. If I leave you here, and he comes with men..." He let the sentence hang. They both knew what that meant. If Caldwell arrived while Elias was gone, there would be no one to stand between Sina and the contract. "I go with you," Sina said. Elias turned then, his brow furrowed. "It is 5 miles. Sina, the drifts are deep. The mare will have to break trail. It will be cold enough to freeze your breath to your face. I am not a flower that wilts in the frost." "Elias," she said, stepping onto the porch. Her boots crunched loudly on the ice. "I will not sit here and wait like a mouse in a hole. If they are going to talk, let them talk to my face." Elias looked at her. She towered in the doorway, her shoulders broad under the coat, her jaw set with a stubbornness that matched his own. He nodded once. "Bundle up," he said. The ride was a slow, grueling battle against the elements. The bay mare, strong as she was, struggled in the deep powder, plunging chest deep into drifts before lunging forward again. Elias sat in the saddle, and Sina rode behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist. It was a necessity of travel, nothing more, Elias told himself. But the physical reality of it burned through his layers of sheepskin and flannel. Sina's legs were so long that she had to grip the horse's flanks tightly to keep her balance. He could feel the strength in her thighs, the solid weight of her body pressed against his back. For Sina, the sensation was a confusing mix of terror and safety. She had spent her life trying to make herself smaller, trying not to touch or be touched, knowing that her size made her clumsy or unwanted. But here, on the back of this horse in the middle of a white wasteland, her size was an asset. She could hold on. She pressed her cheek against the rough wool of Elias's coat to shield her face from the biting wind. She could smell the scent of him, wood smoke, leather, and the faint, metallic tang of the rifle scabbard beneath her leg. He was a solid wall against the wind. For the first time since she had stepped off the train, she did not feel like a spectacle. She felt anchored. They did not speak. The effort of the horse and the whistle of the wind made conversation impossible. But with every lurch of the mare, their bodies moved in unison, a forced rhythm of intimacy that settled into their bones. As the town came into view, the tension in Elias's back hardened. The settlement looked bleak under the winter sun, smoke rising straight up from the chimneys. The streets had been partially shoveled, cutting dark trenches through the white. Elias guided the mare onto the main thoroughfare. The sound of hooves on the packed snow drew eyes immediately. A woman sweeping her boardwalk stopped and stared, clutching her broom. 2 men loading barrels onto a sled froze, their breath hanging in the air. "Look," one whispered, loud enough to carry. "It is the beast and the scar." Sina felt the words like a lash. She straightened her spine, pulling her face away from Elias's coat. She would not hide. She locked her eyes on the horizon, refusing to look down at the people who gaped at her. They reached the front of the general store. Elias reined the mare in. Before he could dismount, the door of the store banged open. Silas Caldwell burst out onto the boardwalk. He was red-faced, wrapped in a fur coat that looked too expensive for the rugged setting. He saw them, and his face contorted into a mask of triumph and rage. "There!" he shouted, pointing a gloved finger. "Thief! Kidnapper!" The shout acted like a bell. People began to drift out of the saloon and the livery stable, gathering in a loose semicircle. They kept their distance from Elias's horse, but their eyes were hungry for drama. Caldwell stomped down the steps, waving a piece of paper in the air. "I knew you were a savage." "Elias," he spat, "but stealing a man's property on Christmas Eve, that is a new low, even for a mongrel like you." Elias dismounted slowly. He kept one hand near his hip, not on his gun, but close enough to be a warning. He did not help Sina down immediately. He placed himself between the horse and the merchant. She was freezing in the snow. "Caldwell," Elias said, his voice low and carrying like thunder. She was dying at my fence line. I did not steal anything. I saved a life. Lies! Caldwell shrieked. He looked at the crowd, playing to his audience. She ran away because she is simple-minded. I paid good money for her passage. I have the contract right here. He slapped the paper with his other hand. She is my wife by contract. And you scar-faced dog, you have kept her in your cabin for 3 nights. A ripple of murmuring went through the crowd. Men nudged their wives. Women pulled their shawls tighter. The implication hung heavy and ugly in the frozen air. 3 nights, alone, in the dark. Sin, a woman in the back muttered, on the Lord's birthday. And look at the size of her. A man laughed darkly. Takes a brave man to climb that mountain. Sina felt the blood drain from her face. She sat high on the horse, exposed, humiliated. They were talking about her as if she were a breeding mare, a thing of utility and lust, not a person. She felt dirty. The warmth she had felt against Elias's back evaporated, replaced by the cold shame of being stared at. Caldwell took a step closer to the horse, reaching for the reins. "Get down, girl," he commanded, his voice changing to a sneering, oily tone. "You come back to the house. I will forgive your indiscretion. We will scrub you clean, and you can start working off the debt you owe me." Sina looked at Caldwell's hand reaching for her. She remembered the grip on her wrist. She remembered the smell of whiskey. "No," she said. The word was not loud, but it cut through the murmuring. Caldwell stopped. "What did you say?" "I said no," Sina repeated. Her voice shook, but she forced the volume up. "I do not go with you. You hurt me." "You are..." "Bad man." She struggled with the English, but the meaning was clear. Caldwell's face turned purple. He looked at the crowd, sensing his authority slipping. "She is delirious," he shouted. "He has turned her mind. Sheriff, arrest this man for theft and assault." The sheriff, a weary-looking man with a gray mustache, stepped out from the edge of the crowd. He looked at Elias, then at the hysterical merchant. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Now, Silas," he said slowly. "If the lady says she don't want to go, she is not a lady," Caldwell roared. "She is stuck. I bought her." He lunged for Sina's leg, intending to drag her from the saddle. Elias moved. It was a blur of motion, faster than a man of his size should have been capable of. He caught Caldwell's wrist in midair. He did not strike him. He simply squeezed. Caldwell yelped, dropping to his knees in the snow. "Do not touch her," Elias said. The crowd gasped. The threat of violence, the reputation of the man with the scar, suddenly made the air very thin. Caldwell looked up, pain and hatred in his eyes. "You are dead, Elias. You hear me? I will take everything. I will take your land. I will take your herd. I will have you hanged for kidnapping a woman who belongs to me." "He is right, Elias," the sheriff warned softly. "The law says a contract is a contract. If she ain't your kin, and she ain't your wife, you have no standing here." Elias looked at the sheriff. He looked at the crowd, seeing the judgment, the hunger for a hanging. He looked up at Sina. She sat on the horse, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. She was looking at him as if he were the only solid thing in a world of quicksand. If he let her go, Caldwell would destroy her. He would break her spirit and work her body until she was nothing but a husk. Elias knew what he had to do. It was madness. It was a trap. But it was the only door open. "She does not belong to him," Elias said, his voice booming across the street. Caldwell sneered, nursing his wrist. "And who does she belong to?" "You." Elias took a breath. The cold air seared his throat. "She belongs to herself," he said, "and to me." He turned to look fully at the crowd. "She is not his stock. She is my intended—" Silence slammed into the street. Even the dogs seemed to stop barking. Caldwell laughed, a harsh, barking sound. You are going to marry the giant. You?" "I am," Elias said. "Right now." He looked at Sina. He saw the shock on her face, the way her mouth opened slightly. He stepped closer to the stirrup, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "It is the only way. Sina, he murmured urgently. "The law cannot touch a wife. If you marry me, the contract is void. I can protect you." Sina looked down at him. She saw the desperation in his eyes, but she also saw the kindness she had learned in the cabin. She barely knew this man. He was a stranger with a dark past and a scar that terrified children. But he had rubbed her feet. He had slept on the floor. Caldwell was screaming objections to the sheriff. The crowd was beginning to laugh, jeering at the absurdity of the match. Sina looked at Caldwell, then back at Elias. She made her choice. "Yes," she said. Elias let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He reached up and helped her down. As her boots hit the snow, she stood eye to level with him, towering over the other men. "The preacher," Elias demanded, turning to the sheriff. "Open the church." The church was freezing. The stove had not been lit, and the air inside was colder than the street. There were no candles, no flowers, no organ music. There was only the smell of wet wool, damp wood, and the stale incense of old prayers. The preacher was a thin, nervous man who clearly wanted to be anywhere else. He flipped through his Bible with shaking hands, casting worried glances at the back of the church where half the town had crowded in to watch the spectacle. Elias and Sina stood at the altar. They had not removed their coats. Caldwell stood in the front pew, his arms crossed, his face a mask of fury. He was vibrating with rage, watching his investment slip away. The ceremony was a blur of hasty words. "Do you, Elias, take this woman?" "I do," Elias said. His voice was steady, but Sina could feel the tremor in his hand where it held hers. His palm was calloused and warm, a rough anchor. "Do you, Sina, take this man?" "I do," she whispered. There were no rings. Elias pulled a leather thong from his pocket, something he used for gear repairs, and tied it loosely around her finger. It was grotesque and practical, fitting for the day. "I pronounce you man and wife," the preacher mumbled, closing the book with a snap. There was no kiss. Elias simply squeezed her hand, then let go. Caldwell stood up immediately. "This is a farce," he shouted, his voice echoing in the rafters. "A sham. You think this hides what you are?" "Elias, you think this washes the dirt off?" He pointed a finger at Sina. "You will regret this, woman. You have tied yourself to a sinking stone, and you, Elias, watch your back. The winter is long, and accidents happen." He stormed out, his boots hammering the floorboards. The crowd parted for him, then began to file out, casting looks of pity and amusement at the newlywed standing alone at the altar. The sheriff walked up to the railing. He looked tired. "You bought yourself some trouble, son," he said to Elias. "Caldwell has friends, big cattlemen. They have been wanting your water rights for the stream. Now you gave them a reason to come for you. I will be ready," Elias said. The sheriff looked at Sina, then tipped his hat. "Good luck to you, ma'am. You are going to need it." The ride back to the ranch was different. The silence was no longer companionable. It was heavy with the weight of what they had done. The sun was sinking low, painting the snow in shades of violet and bruised blue. They were married. The word circled in Sina's mind, terrifying and abstract. She was the wife of the scarred man. She was Mrs. Elias. She looked at the back of his head, at the sheepskin collar of his coat. She had bound her life to his to escape a monster. But now she had to live with a stranger. When they reached the cabin, the sun was gone. The cold was absolute. Elias stabled the horse, moving with a mechanical slowness. Sina went inside and lit the lantern. The cabin, which had felt like a shelter during the storm, now felt suffocatingly small. The bed took up half the room. The air felt charged, tight with unspoken expectations. Elias came in, stamping the snow from his boots. He hung his hat on the peg and looked at her. For the first time, he seemed unsure of where to put his eyes. He looked at the stove, at the floor, at the window, anywhere but at her. "We need to eat," he said. He busied himself with the fire, his movements jerky. Sina stood by the table, still in her coat. She felt trapped. The reality of the marriage contract, the legal rights a husband had over a wife, pressed in on her. Caldwell had made those rites very clear. Did Elias believe in them too? They ate bread and cheese in silence. The chewing sounded loud. When the meal was done, the moment arrived. The fire cracked, a sharp sound like a pistol shot. Elias stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness. "Sina," he started, his voice tight. About tonight." Sina's heart hammered against her ribs. She gripped the edge of the table. "The law says," he stopped, then started again. "You are my wife now. In the eyes of the town, in the eyes of the church." He turned to face her. He looked agonizingly uncomfortable. "But I know why you said yes. It was a trap or a cage. You chose the cage. I chose the man who did not hurt me," Sina said softly. Elias looked at the bed. "The single, narrow bed. I can sleep in the barn," he said. "There is hay." "It is not so cold with the horses." Sina looked at the barn door. It was 20 degrees below zero outside. If he slept in the barn, he would freeze. He would die for her comfort. "No," she said. "You cannot. You will die." "Then, the floor," he suggested. "Like before." "You are my husband," she said, the word tasting strange. "Husbands do not sleep on the floor." She was trembling. She was terrified of the act, terrified of the pain she associated with men's desire. But she was also a practical woman. A wife had duties. And somewhere, deep beneath the fear, was a flicker of hope. He had been gentle with her feet. He had defended her. Maybe it would not be like Caldwell said. "We share," she whispered. Elias watched her. He saw the tremble in her hands. He nodded slowly. He blew out the lantern. The room plunged into the soft, orange glow of the stove's draft. They undressed in the shadows, backs turned to one another. The rustle of fabric was the only sound. Elias stripped down to his long underwear. Sina removed her dress, standing in her chemise. They climbed into the bed. It was narrower than ever. They lay on their backs, staring at the ceiling. The heat of their bodies mingled under the quilt. Elias was rigid. He was a man of 35, starved for touch, lying next to a woman he had legally married. The desire was there, a dull, aching thrum in his blood. He wanted to turn to her. He wanted to hold her, not just to take, but to be held, to bury his face in her neck and forget the winter. He turned his head slightly. "Sina." She turned to face him. Her eyes were wide, dark pools in the dim light. He reached out a hand. He moved slowly, giving her time to pull away. He brushed his fingertips against her cheek. Her skin was soft. Sina held her breath. She wanted this. She wanted to be close. But as his hand moved down to her shoulder, a memory flashed. Caldwell's thick fingers digging into her arm. The smell of whiskey. The feeling of being trapped. Her body betrayed her. She flinched. A sharp, violent jerk of her shoulder, pulling away from his touch. Elias froze. He saw the fear in her eyes, the way she braced herself as if expecting a blow. He pulled his hand back as if he had touched a hot stove. He sat up, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed, putting his back to her. His breathing was ragged, loud in the quiet room. "I am sorry," he rasped. Sina lay there, tears stinging her eyes. She had ruined it. She had insulted him. "It is not you, Elias. I'm afraid." Elias put his head in his hands. He rubbed his face hard. "I am not him." "Sina, I know," she whispered. He did not turn back to her. He spoke to the wall. "I will not touch you," he said, his voice flat and final. "Not like that. Not until you want it. Not until you ask for it. The paper says I can. The town says I should, but I will not." He stood up and walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. Sina watched his silhouette. The tears spilled over. Hot tracks on her temples. They were not tears of fear anymore. They were tears of shock. In her world, men took what they wanted. Strength was used to conquer. Elias had the strength to take her, and he was using it to stop himself. She wanted to call him back. She wanted to explain, but the words were stuck in her throat, blocked by the shame of her flinch. Elias stayed at the window until his breathing slowed. Then, silently, he came back to the bed. He lay down on the absolute edge, leaving a wide gulf of cold mattress between them. "Good night, Sina," he whispered. "Good night," she replied, her voice breaking. They lay side by side in the darkness, the silence between them thick with everything they could not say. The fire crackled, dying down to embers, leaving them alone with the cold and the terrible, beautiful weight of his restraint. The grip of winter did not break all at once. It released the land reluctantly, inch by agonizing inch. The blinding white silence of January gave way to the gray, weeping skies of February, and then to the slush and mud of March. The world turned brown and heavy. The drifts that had buried the fences slumped into dirty mounds, revealing the broken wire and snapped posts beneath. For Elias and Sina, the thaw meant labor. The romance of survival, of huddled warmth and shared silence, was replaced by the grinding reality of running a ranch that had been neglected for too long. There were no hired hands, no neighbors to call on. There was only the man with the bad leg and the woman who was too large for the town. They worked from the moment the sun grayed the eastern horizon until it fell behind the peaks. They moved in a rhythm born of necessity. Elias rode the lines, checking the herd, while Sina took over the tasks near the cabin. But as the mud deepened, making the footing treacherous for the horses, they found themselves working side by side more often than not. It was in this mud that the dynamic between them shifted. One afternoon, they were repairing a section of corral fence that the snow had crushed. The posts were heavy lodgepole pine, waterlogged and slick with rot. Elias, favoring his left leg which ached fiercely in the damp cold, struggled to leverage a corner post into its hole. His boots slipped in the muck, his breath hissing through his teeth as the weight threatened to buckle his knee. "Leave it," Sina said. She did not wait for him to argue. She dropped the hammer she was holding and stepped into the mud beside him. She did not shove him aside. She simply placed her shoulder under the wood, her large hands gripping the rough bark. "On 3, she said. Elias looked at her. Her hem was tied up around her waist, revealing men's trousers she had sewn from an old pair of his. Her boots caked in clay. Her face was set in a grimace of effort. 1, 2, 3. She surged upward. The post, which had been dragging Elias down, rose into the air as if it were made of balsa wood. She grunted low in her throat, a guttural sound of pure exertion, and guided the timber into the hole with a thud that shook the ground. Elias stood back, wiping sweat and rain from his eyes. He watched her tamp the dirt down around the base, her movements efficient and powerful. He had spent his life watching men work. He knew the geometry of leverage and muscle, but seeing her, this woman who had been mocked for her size, used that very mass to conquer the earth. He felt something shift in his chest. It was not intimidation. It was relief. She stood up, brushing her hands on her trousers, and caught him staring. She froze, the old shame flickering in her eyes. "I am strong like an ox," she muttered, looking down. "It is not ladylike." Elias stepped forward. The mud sucked at his boots. "No," he said firmly. "It is not ladylike." He reached out and took the shovel from her hand. "It is better. An ox cannot set a post straight. You have a builder's eye. Sina." He looked at the fence, then back at her. "My leg was giving out. I would have been here until dark without you." Sina looked at him, searching for the mockery she was used to. She found only a quiet, weary gratitude. A slow smile spread across her face, changing the landscape of her features. "Then we finish early," she said, "and you make the coffee." The evenings became their sanctuary. The cabin, once a place of suffocating confinement, grew into a home. The air smelled of wet wool drying by the stove, of coffee and sawdust. Sina's English was improving rapidly. She had a hungry mind, devouring the words he gave her. They sat at the table after supper, the lantern hissing softly, repairing harness leather or mending clothes. One night, the conversation turned to the past, as it often did when the wind picked up outside. Sina was sewing a patch onto Elias's shirt, her needle flashing in the yellow light. "In Norway," she said quietly, without looking up. The boys at the dances, they made jokes. Elias looked up from the bridle he was oiling. What kind of jokes? They said a man needs a ladder to kiss Sina. They said no man wants a woman taller than him in bed, because then he feels small. She pulled the thread tight, biting it off. They said a wife should be like a little bird, something to hold in one hand. I am an eagle, too big for the cage. Elias set the bridle down. He wiped his hands on a rag. Taking his time, he thought of the women in the saloon in town, the painted birds with their shrill laughter. He thought of the delicate, fainting things in the novels his mother used to read. Then he looked at Sina. He looked at the broad slope of her shoulders, the length of her arms, the capacity in her chest for breath and life. Small men need small women, Elias said. Sina stopped sewing. She looked at him. I have spent a lot of my life alone. Sina, sleeping in the brush, riding fences where you don't see another soul for weeks. The silence out here. It eats you. It makes you feel like you are nothing, just a speck of dust. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. I do not care if a woman is taller than me. I do not care if she is wider. I only care if she is there. He felt the blood rushing to his cheeks, a heat he hadn't felt since he was a schoolboy. When I wake up now, and I see you, I do not feel small. Sina, I feel located like I exist, because you are big enough to be real. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick and warm. Sina stared at him. Her lips parted slightly. The shame that had followed her across the ocean. The voice of Caldwell calling her a freak. The laughter of the village boys. It didn't vanish, but it receded, pushed back by the quiet, blushing honesty of a scarred rancher. It was a Tuesday in late March when the wall between them finally crumbled. Elias had ridden out to the south pasture to check on a calf that had been separated from its mother. He returned earlier than expected, the sun still hanging low in the west, casting long, golden beams through the gaps in the clouds. He tied the horse and walked to the cabin, exhausted and cold. He opened the door without knocking, expecting to find Sina at the stove. Instead, he found her at the wash basin. She had clearly thought she had another hour of privacy. The fire was roared up high, heating the small room. She was standing in the center of the floor, bathed in the firelight. Her hair was down, a heavy curtain of gold falling past her waist. Her dress was unbuttoned and hitched up, tucked into the waistband of her petticoats to keep it dry. Her legs were bare from the knees down. Stepping into the tin basin, she was washing herself with a rag, water sluicing down her calves. Elias froze in the doorway. The cold air rushed past him, swirling around her ankles, but she didn't move. She just stared at him. The wet rag clutched to her chest. For a moment, he could not breathe. He had seen her legs before, frozen and blue, when he had saved her life. But this was different. These were not the limbs of a dying victim. These were the legs of a woman. They were strong, pale columns of muscle, shaped by work and endurance. He saw the water dripping from her shin. He saw the curve of her calf. He saw the way her feet gripped the metal bottom of the basin. She was not dainty. She was powerful. She was real. And the desire that hit him was not the frantic, hungry lust of a lonely man, but something deeper, a reverence for her solidity. He should have turned around. He should have backed out and apologized, but his feet were rooted to the floorboards. Sina did not cover herself. She did not shriek. She stood her ground, water dripping, her chest heaving slightly. Elias stepped inside and closed the door, cutting off the wind. The latch clicked, a loud sound in the quiet room. He leaned against the doorframe, a slow, tired smile touching his lips. He nodded toward her legs. What is between your legs now? He asked softly. Just cold water and stubbornness? It was a risk, a joke that called back to their first terrified night, to the knife, to the fear. Sina blinked. Then, the corner of her mouth twitched. A flush rose from her neck to her hairline, turning her skin a deep, rosy red. But she did not look away. She lifted her chin, shaking her hair back. She looked down at herself, then back at him, her eyes dancing with a sudden, fierce light. "Between my legs," she said, her voice steady despite the blush, "is my own body, not bought and not taken." The air in the room changed. It thickened. The playfulness in her voice was a challenge and an invitation. Elias took off his hat and hung it on the peg. He walked slowly across the room. He stopped 3 feet from her. He could smell the soap she was using, lye and lavender. "It is a good body," he said. Sina stepped out of the basin. She did not reach for a towel. She stood on the damp wood floor, towering over him by an inch, maybe 2. For the first time, Elias did not feel the need to hide his hands or his face. "May I?" he whispered. Sina nodded. He reached out and touched her waist. His hands were large, rough with calluses, but his touch was feather-light. He pulled her gently toward him. She came willingly. That night, the wind outside was not a scream but a sigh. The stove cast a soft, pulsing glow across the room, turning the log walls to amber. They lay in the narrow bed, the quilt kicked down to their feet. It was not smooth. It was not the romance of the dime novels. It was 2 large, broken people trying to fit their jagged edges together. When Elias first kissed her, really kissed her, there was a clash of teeth and a nervous laugh from Sina that vibrated against his lips. He tasted of tobacco and coffee. She tasted of the lavender soap. He ran his hands down the length of her back, marveling at the breadth of her. She was endless. There was so much of her to hold, but when his hand moved to her hip, grazing the skin near where the knife used to sit, Sina stiffened. Her body went rigid, her breath catching in a gasp. The ghost of Caldwell, the ghost of every man who had looked at her with greed, was suddenly in the bed with them. Elias stopped instantly. He did not pull away, but he froze his hands. "Sina," he whispered into her hair. "I am sorry," she gasped, squeezing her eyes shut. "I am trying. Don't try," he murmured. "Just be." He waited. He waited until her breathing slowed. He waited until she realized he was not going to force past her fear. He kissed the scar on her shoulder where a strap had dug in 2 deep years ago. He kissed her temple. Sina opened her eyes. She saw him waiting. She saw the patience in his dark eyes, a patience born of his own suffering. She reached out and pulled him closer. She wrapped her long legs around his hips, pulling him into the cradle of her body. It was her choice, her movement. When they finally joined, it was awkward and fumbling. There was pain, and there was friction. But when Elias groaned, burying his face in her neck, and when Sina arched her back, finding a rhythm that belonged only to them, the awkwardness dissolved into a profound, aching relief. It was not a conquering. It was a collapse. A collapsing of defenses, of walls, of the terrible distance they had both maintained from the world. Sina cried. She did not mean to, but the tears leaked from her eyes, hot and fast. Elias kissed them away, tasting the salt. "You are here," he whispered against her skin. "You are here." The next morning, the sun rose on a world that looked exactly the same. The mud was still deep, the cattle were still thin, the fence still needed fixing. But inside the cabin, the axis of the world had tilted. Elias woke first. He watched Sina sleep for a long time, her arm thrown over her eyes, her hair spread across his pillow like a golden spill. He got up quietly and made the coffee. When Sina woke, she did not pull the covers up to her chin. She sat up, stretching her long back, the quilt falling to her waist. She looked at Elias at the stove. He brought her a cup. He did not set it on the table. He handed it to her, his fingers brushing hers. Then, without thinking, she reached out and smoothed a piece of hair that was sticking up on the back of his head. "Morning," she said. "Morning, Mrs. Elias," he replied. The title was no longer a shield against the law. It was a secret, a warm, living thing that belonged only to them. But the world outside the fence line did not tolerate happiness easily. 2 weeks later, the attacks began. It started with the water. Elias rode out to the creek that fed their main trough, the lifeline of the ranch. The smell hit him 50 yards out. a sweet, cloying stench of rot. He dismounted and walked to the trough. It was filled with dead fish, hundreds of them, bloated and pale, floating in the water. They had been netted from the river and dumped here to rot, poisoning the supply. Elias stood staring at the floating bodies, his hands curling into fists. It was a petty, vicious act. It was not just about water. It was about contamination. It was a message. You are dirty. Everything you touch is dirty. He spent the day draining the trough, scrubbing the wood with sand and lye until his hands were raw, while the cattle bawled with thirst behind the fence. Sina helped him, hauling fresh buckets from the spring a mile up the hill. She did not complain. She walked with a grim fury, her boots sinking in the mud, carrying weight that would have broken a lesser woman. 3 nights later, they woke to the smell of smoke. "Fire!" Elias shouted, rolling from the bed. They ran out into the night in their night clothes. The south wall of the barn was licking with orange flames. Someone had doused the dry wood with kerosene. They fought the fire with buckets and wet blankets, choking on the acrid smoke. Sina ran into the burning structure to cut the horses loose, slapping their rumps to drive them out into the dark. She emerged with soot covering her face, her eyebrows singed, dragging a terrified calf by its tail. They saved the barn, mostly. But in the chaos, 3 of the heifers had bolted into the ravine and broken their legs in the dark. Elias had to shoot them as the sun came up. The sound of the rifle shots echoed off the hills, flat and final. The sheriff came at noon. He sat on his horse, looking at the charred wood of the barn and the carcasses of the cows. "Hard luck, Elias," he said, shifting his toothpick. "Hard luck," Elias rasped, his face streaked with soot. "This was kerosene. I found the rag." The sheriff sighed. "Could be a drifter. Could be an accident. You got no proof it was Caldwell?" "Caldwell is the only man who wants me dead," Elias said. The sheriff looked at Sina, who was standing on the porch, washing the soot from her arms. "Folks talk. Elias, they say it is unnatural. You and her. They say God don't look kindly on it. Maybe this is just judgment." Elias stepped forward, his hand dropping to the colt on his hip. "Get off my land," he said softly. The sheriff shrugged. "I am just telling you what is being said. You push people, they push back." He turned his horse and rode away. That afternoon, Sina went into town for seed corn and fabric. She had to go. They could not stop living. But the atmosphere had curdled. When she walked into the dry goods store, not Caldwell's, but the smaller one at the end of the street, the conversation died. 2 women she had spoken to the week before, who had asked her about her knitting, turned their backs. "I heard she sleeps with a knife." One whispered, "I heard she crushes the life out of things." The other replied, "A man pulled his wife away as Sina passed, as if her shadow were contagious." Sina held her head high, bought her goods, and walked out. But the sting went deep. It was not the fear of violence. It was the isolation, the feeling that no matter how hard she worked, she would always be the monster. That evening, the despair finally breached the cabin walls. Elias sat at the table, his head in his hands. The ledger was open before him. "We lost 3 cows," he said. "The barn needs lumber we can't afford. If they poison the creek again." He looked up at her. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. "We should go." Sina stopped wiping the table. "Go, sell the herd. What is left of it? Pack the wagon. We can go south, Arizona, Texas, somewhere where nobody knows about the contract, where nobody knows my face." He stood up, pacing the small room. "I cannot fight the whole town. Sina, I can shoot a man who draws on me, but I cannot shoot gossip. I cannot shoot a poisoned creek. They will grind us down until there is nothing left." Sina watched him. She saw the fear in him, not for himself, but for her. He wanted to run to save her from the cruelty. She walked to the door and opened it. "Come," she said. Elias frowned. "What?" "Come." She led him out into the twilight. The air was crisp, smelling of melting snow and wet earth. She walked to the corner of the cabin, near the window where the morning sun hit first. There, in a patch of mud she had cleared, was a small, green thing. It was a sapling, a tiny spruce tree, barely a foot high, that she had dug up from the timberline and replanted here. "I planted this today," she said. Elias looked at the twig. "Sina, we are talking about leaving, and you are planting trees." "In Norway," she said, kneeling in the mud to cup the needles. "The winter is long, dark for months. But the green trees, they stay. The snow buries them. The wind tries to snap them, but they stay." She looked up at him. "I ran from Norway. I ran from New York. I ran from Caldwell's house into the snow." She stood up, drawing herself to her full height. She was magnificent in the fading light, dirty and tired and unyielding. "I am done running. Elias, this is my home. You are my home." She pointed to the darkened valley. "Let them poison the water. We will dig a well. Let them burn the barn. We will build it with green wood that does not burn. If we run, they win. If we run, we are just the freak and the killer they say we are." She stepped closer to him, placing her hands on his chest. "We stay. We grow roots. Like the tree." Elias looked at the sapling, so small and fragile against the vast, hostile landscape. Then he looked at his wife. He felt the strength radiating from her, a heat that warmed the cold places in his soul. He covered her hands with his. "We stay," he whispered. The decision settled them. The anxiety of flight was replaced by the grim determination of a siege. Their intimacy deepened, moving beyond the bedroom into the quiet corners of their lives. It became a fortress. Elias began to learn her language. He asked her for the words for the things they loved. "Hest," he would say, patting the mare's neck. "Ild," he would whisper, stoking the fire. "Elskeda." She taught him one night, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Beloved." One rainy afternoon, they were trapped inside again. Elias was sitting in the rocking chair, exhausted from digging post holes. Sina sat on a stool at his feet, patching the knee of his trousers while he was still wearing them. "Rest," she told him. Elias leaned his head back and closed his eyes. He felt the tug of the needle, the brush of her hand against his shin. It was a position of total vulnerability, to sit with his eyes closed, to let someone work on him. He felt Sina's head come to rest on his knee. She paused in her sewing, simply leaning against him. He reached down and laid his hand on her hair. He didn't move it. He just held her there. The rain drummed on the roof. The fire popped. Outside, there were men who wanted to destroy them. There were whispers that called them monsters. But in here, in the quiet, dim cabin, with the smell of wet earth and lavender soap, they were unbreakable. They were weaving a net of small moments, a Norwegian word, a mended shirt, a planted tree that would catch them when the world tried to let them fall. Spring bled into summer, not with the gentle unfurling of flowers, but with the grinding reality of mud that turned to concrete under the baking sun. The high plains shed their white skin to reveal a landscape of brown scrub and gray rock, vast and indifferent to the struggles of the people clinging to its surface. For Elias and Sina, the season brought a relentless, dawn-to-dusk labor that left them too exhausted for fear and barely awake enough for love. The thaw had revealed the full extent of the winter's damage. Fences lay in tangled heaps of wire and rotted wood. The roof of the barn, scorched by the fire, leaked whenever the spring squalls rolled in off the mountains. They worked side by side, a team of two against the inevitable decay of the frontier. Sina wore trousers now, a scandal to the few travelers who passed by on the road, but a necessity for the work. She moved with a rhythmic power that Elias often paused to watch. She could swing a scythe through the new ryegrass as steadily as a pendulum, her long arms clearing a swath that would take a normal man 2 passes. The bond between them hardened like the calluses on their hands. It was no longer the desperate clinging of 2 drowning people. It was the forged iron of a partnership. They communicated in a shorthand of nods and glances. A tilt of Elias's head meant check the south gate. A narrowing of Sina's eyes meant the coffee is ready. But the pressure from outside the fence line did not relent. It tightened like a garrote. It started with small things. The credit account at the feed store was suddenly closed, the clerk murmuring apologetically about new management policies. A shipment of barbed wire Elias had ordered never arrived, lost on the train or diverted by hands that had been greased. Then came the paper. Elias stood at the kitchen table one evening in June, staring down at a document Silas Caldwell had nailed to their gate post. The paper was thick, official-looking, covered in the tight, spiderweb script of lawyers. Elias's hands, usually so sure when handling a Colt or a rifle, shook slightly. He traced the lines of ink with a rough finger. He could read the numbers, dates, dollar amounts, and he could read his own name. But the dense paragraphs of legal phrasing were a thicket he could not hack through. His literacy was a patchy thing, learned by firelight in army camps, sufficient for a Bible verse but helpless against this. "Read it to me," he said, his voice tight with shame. Sina took the paper. Her English had grown strong, fed by the books Elias had in the cabin and her own fierce intelligence. But the legal language twisted her tongue. "It says, agreement," she read slowly, her brow furrowing. "It says you sold the water rights to the stream, access for 50 years. She looked up, her blue eyes wide. "It says you signed it, Elias, last autumn, before I came." Elias slammed his fist onto the table, making the lantern jump. "I signed nothing," he roared. "I would sooner cut off my hand than sell the water. Without the stream, the land is dust. The cattle die. We die." He snatched the paper back, staring at the bottom. There, next to a signature that looked like a clumsy imitation of his own hand, was an X mark. "He knows," Elias whispered, the anger draining away into a cold pit of dread. "Caldwell knows I am not a scholar. He knows I cannot argue with a piece of paper in a court. He has found a partner, a big cattleman from the south who wants the grass." They sat in the dim light, the silence of the prairie pressing against the logs, the physical threats, the fire, the poison. Elias could fight. He could shoot a man who tried to burn his barn, but he could not shoot a piece of paper. He could not shoot a lie that was written down and stamped with a seal. Hope arrived in July, riding a dusty carriage pulled by 2 weary bays. News spread through the territory that a circuit judge was making his rounds before the autumn snows closed the passes. Judge Halloway was known to be a sour man, impatient with foolishness, but unbribable. Traveling with him, rumors said, was a man from the Pinkerton agency, a Mr. Vance, looking into cattle rustling and fraud in the territory. Elias saw the window. It was narrow, barely a crack, but it was the only light they had. He began to gather what he called his ammunition. It was a pathetic arsenal against the wealth of Caldwell and his new partners. He had the original marriage contract Caldwell had tried to force on Sina, a document that proved Caldwell viewed her as property. He had a small notebook where he had written down the dates of the fire and the poisoning, in his own rough spelling, and he had witnesses. Or he hoped he did. He rode to the nearest neighbor, a man named Henderson, who had seen the smoke from the barn fire but had been too afraid to speak. He rode to the town, cornering the young clerk who had been working the day Caldwell was drunk and bragging about breaking the rancher. But the strongest weapon, and the heaviest burden, lay with Sina. 2 days before the hearing, Elias sat on the porch step, cleaning his boots. Sina was churning butter, the rhythmic thwack splash of the dasher the only sound in the heat. "You do not have to do it," Elias said, not looking up. Sina did not stop churning. "Do what? Speak," he said, "to the judge." He set the boot down. "To tell the story. You will have to say what he did, what he tried to do, in the house, and the contract." He looked at her then. "They will look at you, Sina, the men in the town. They will look at you, and they will judge you. A woman who speaks of such things. They do not call her brave. They call her soiled." Sina stopped the dasher. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. She looked out at the horizon, where the heat shimmered off the sagebrush. The thought of standing in a room full of men who already whispered that she was a freak, a giantess, a monster, and telling them about Caldwell's hands on her body made her stomach twist into a hard, cold knot. She wanted to hide. She wanted to stay on the ranch where she was just Sina, where she was strong and safe. But then she thought of the paper with the forged signature. She thought of the dead fish in the trough. She thought of Elias, working himself into the ground to protect her, carrying the weight of his illiteracy like a stone around his neck. "If I do not speak," she said quietly, "he wins." Elias stood up and walked to her. He did not touch her, but he stood close enough that she could feel the heat of him. "If you speak," he said, "I will stand beside you. Not in front of you. I will not hide you. But if you fall, I catch you. And if you cannot finish, I will finish it for you." Sina looked up at him. His face was lined by the sun and scarred by violence, but his eyes were the gentlest things she had ever known. "I will speak," she said. The day before the hearing, the violence that had been simmering under the surface finally boiled over. It happened near the North Creek. Elias and Sina were checking the herd, accompanied by Leo, a boy of 16 who lived on the impoverished homestead to the west. Leo was of mixed heritage, his mother a Shoshone woman and his father a trapper who had long since vanished. He was one of the few souls in the valley who treated Sina without fear. He brought them wild berries. She mended his shirts. He had a smile that showed a chipped front tooth and a heart that was too open for the frontier. They were moving a stubborn bull back toward the main herd when 3 riders appeared on the ridge. It was Caldwell's men, not the merchant himself, but the hard-eyed drifters he paid to enforce his will. "You're on private land," one of them shouted, waving a Winchester rifle. "This water belongs to the association now. It belongs to me until a judge says different," Elias yelled back, his hand hovering near his pistol. The rider laughed. "The judge is a busy man. Maybe we save him the trouble." He raised the rifle. He did not aim at Elias. He aimed at the ground near the bull, intending to spook the herd. "A warning shot!" He called out. The gun cracked. The bullet struck a rock, a piece of granite hard as iron. It did not bury itself in the earth. It screamed off the stone, a ricochet that defied the odds of aim or intention. Leo, who was riding a scrawny pony 10 yards to Elias's left, jerked backward. There was no cry, no dramatic flailing. He simply slid from the saddle like a sack of grain. "Leo!" Sina screamed, the sound tearing her throat. Elias spurred his horse, reaching the boy before he hit the ground, but he was too late. Leo landed in the dirt, the dry dust puffing up around him. The riders on the ridge froze. They had meant to scare, not to kill. Silence slammed down over the valley, broken only by the bawling of the bull. Elias leaped from his horse and fell to his knees beside the boy. He turned him over. Leo's eyes were open, staring up at the vast, empty blue of the sky. A small, dark hole was centered in his chest. The dust was already settling on his unblinking eyes. He was gone, in a heartbeat. A boy who liked berry pie and had never hurt a living soul. Elias stared at the face of the dead boy, and in that moment, the rancher vanished. The man who had spent 10 years trying to build a peaceful life, trying to bury the violence of his past, disintegrated. In his place was the soldier, the gunfighter, the man who had killed in Abilene. A sound came out of Elias, a roar of pure, blackened agony that sounded more animal than human. He grabbed his Colt from its holster. He stood up, turning toward the ridge. His vision tunneled. He did not see men, he saw targets. He saw the red haze of blood. He was going to kill them. He was going to ride up that ridge and put a bullet in every single one of them. And then he was going to ride into town and kill Caldwell, and he did not care if he died doing it. "Elias!" Sina was there. She had thrown herself off her horse. She grabbed his arm, the one holding the gun. "Let me go!" Elias snarled, struggling against her. He was blind with rage, his teeth bared. "They killed him! They killed the boy!" "Elias, no!" She wrapped her arms around him from behind, pinning his arms to his sides. She was strong, stronger than any woman had a right to be. But Elias was fueled by a demon. He thrashed, dragging her through the dust. "I will kill them!" he screamed. "I will send them to hell! Look at me!" Sina shouted, burying her face in his shoulder, holding on with everything she had. Look at me, Elias. If you kill them, you are lost. You are the killer they say you are. Her weight, her scent, the solid reality of her body anchored him. He fought her, sobbing with rage, his chest heaving. They took him. Sina. He wept, his strength suddenly breaking. He was just a boy. I know, she whispered, tears streaming down her dusty face. I know, but you cannot bring him back with blood. You cannot leave me alone, Elias. If you ride up that hill, you never come back. Elias sank to his knees in the dirt, dragging Sina down with him. The riders on the ridge, terrified by what they had done, wheeled their horses and galloped away. Elias bowed his head over the boy's body, his shoulders shaking with violent sobs. Sina held him, rocking him back and forth in the dust, her chin resting on his head, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the killers had fled. She did not look away. She absorbed his grief and his rage, holding the pieces of him together when he had shattered. The hearing was held in the back room of the Golden Steer Saloon. It was the only space in town large enough to hold the crowd that gathered. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and the sweat of 50 men packed into a small space. A single ceiling fan turned lazily, doing nothing to cut the stifling July heat. Judge Holloway sat at a poker table that had been draped with a black cloth. He was a man with a face like a dried apple and eyes that missed nothing. Beside him sat Mr. Vance, the Pinkerton agent, a man in a gray suit who wrote constantly in a small notebook. Elias sat on a stool to the left, his hat in his hands. He looked aged. The grief of Leo's death hung on him like a shroud. He had buried the boy that morning, digging the grave himself in the hard earth. Caldwell sat to the right, flanked by his lawyer and Mr. Sterling, the cattle partner. Caldwell looked nervous. He kept wiping his upper lip with a silk handkerchief. The proceedings were informal but tense. Caldwell's lawyer spoke first, waving the forged document. Speaking of contract law and property rights, he painted Elias as a squatter, a violent man who was obstructing progress. Then it was Elias's turn. He stood up. He did not speak of the water. He spoke of the boy. They killed a child yesterday, Elias said, his voice flat and dead. A boy of 16. They call it an accident. I call it the price of your progress. Objection, the lawyer shouted. Irrelevant. The judge waved a hand. Sit down. Counselor, I will decide what is relevant. Elias sat down. He looked at Sina, who was sitting on a bench against the wall. She was wearing her best dress, the dark wool one she had arrived in. Despite the heat, she looked terrified. I call Mrs. Elias to speak, Elias said softly. A murmur went through the room. The giant bride, the freak. Sina stood up. Her head nearly brushed the low beams of the ceiling. She walked to the center of the room. She felt the eyes on her, hundreds of eyes, stripping her, judging her. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. State your name, the judge said. Sina, she said. Sina, Elias. She took a breath. She looked at Caldwell. He was sneering at her, a look of warning in his eyes. Remember who you are. His eyes said, You are nothing. She looked at Elias. He nodded. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement. I am here. I come from Norway, she began, her voice halting but clear. I come to be a wife, Mr. Caldwell. He bought the ticket. She paused. The room was silent. He met me at the train. He did not look at my face. He looked at my legs. He looked at my back. He told the people I was stock, like a cow. She saw a woman in the front row look down at her lap. He took me to his house. Scene continued, her voice gaining strength. He showed me a paper. He said it gave him my money, my work, and my body. She pointed a long finger at the merchant. He drank the whiskey. He said he wanted his money's worth before the church. He tried to take me on the floor. I pushed him, and I ran into the snow. The room was deathly quiet. The heat seemed to intensify. Elias found me, she said, turning to the judge. He did not ask for money. He did not ask for my body. He gave me his bed. He rubbed the frost from my feet. He is a man of honor. Mr. Caldwell is a man of nothing. She stopped. She was trembling, but she stood tall. refusing to shrink. Caldwell jumped up, knocking his chair over. "She lies," he screamed. "She is a simpleton, a savage. Look at her. She is a monster." Mr. Vance, the Pinkerton agent, stood up then. He closed his notebook with a snap. "Sit down, Mr. Caldwell," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight of authority that silenced the room. Vance walked to the table. "I have been checking the telegraph records," he said calmly. "It seems Mr. Caldwell has a history of disputes over contracts and debt, considerable gambling debt in St. Louis. And this document," he picked up the forged water rights paper. "The ink is barely dry, and the signature, well, I have seen Mr. Elias's signature on the marriage certificate. It is a shaky thing. This signature here, it flows quite smoothly. Too smoothly for a man who struggles to read." The judge looked at the paper. He looked at Caldwell, who was now sweating profusely. "This court finds the document to be a forgery," the judge declared, slamming his gavel onto the poker table. "And regarding the death of the boy, I am recommending a grand jury investigation into Mr. Caldwell and his associates for manslaughter." The room exploded into noise. Caldwell looked wild, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped rat. He saw the sheriff moving toward him. He saw the townspeople, the ones he had bullied and owned for years, looking at him with disgust. "No!" he shrieked. "You cannot do this to me. I built this town." He reached into his coat. He pulled out a Derringer, a small, nasty hideout gun. "Back off!" he screamed. The crowd scrambled back, overturning chairs. Caldwell lunged toward the only exit that wasn't blocked, the side door that led to the alley. He grabbed the person nearest to it. It was Sina. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the flesh. He jammed the small pistol into her ribs. "Move!" he shouted, dragging her out the door. "Anyone follows, she dies." Elias was on his feet before the door swung shut. He drew his coat. He moved through the crowd like a wolf, knocking men aside. He burst out into the alley. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the dust. Caldwell was dragging Sina toward the church at the end of the street, using her large body as a shield. Sina was stumbling, trying to keep her footing, her face a mask of shock. "Let her go! Caldwell!" Elias roared, raising his gun. Caldwell stopped near the edge of the ravine that ran behind the church, a steep drop-off down to the rocky creek bed below. He spun Sina around, keeping the gun pressed hard against her side. "Stay back!" Caldwell screamed. His face was twisted, unrecognizable. "You ruined me! You and this freak!" Elias stopped 20 paces away. He leveled his pistol. His heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had the shot. He could put a bullet in Caldwell's head. He had done it before, in Abilene. The old instinct was singing in his blood. End it! Kill him! Save her! The crowd spilled out of the saloon, watching from a distance. The sheriff had his gun out but couldn't fire without hitting Sina. Elias's finger tightened on the trigger. The world narrowed down to the front sight of his gun and the spot between Caldwell's eyes. "Elias!" It was Sina. Her voice was not a scream. It was a command. She looked at him, even with the gun in her ribs, even with death breathing down her neck. She looked at him. She saw the look in his eyes, the dead, cold look of the killer, the look that had haunted him for 10 years. She shook her head, a small, firm movement. "Do not do it," she said. "If you kill him—" "Elias," she called out, her voice steady and ringing in the evening air. "You become him. You become the monster. Do not let him take your soul." "Not for me." Elias froze. The red haze in his vision wavered. He looked at Sina, her strength, her refusal to be a victim, her refusal to let him destroy himself. He lowered the gun an inch. Caldwell saw the hesitation. He laughed, a high, jagged sound. "He hasn't got the guts," Caldwell sneered. He tried to shove Sina toward Elias, aiming to knock the rancher off balance so he could fire, but he forgot who he was holding. Sina braced her legs. She planted her feet in the dust, immovable as an oak tree. When Caldwell pushed, she did not move. Instead, the force of his own shove rebounded. His boots, slick-soled and suited for indoors, slipped on the loose gravel at the edge of the ravine. He flailed, his arms pinwheeled. Sina stepped back, disengaging from his grip. Caldwell's gun went off with a loud crack, the bullet flying harmlessly into the evening sky. He tipped backward. His eyes went wide with sudden, absolute realization. He fell. There was no scream, just the sound of a body hitting the rocks below. A sickening, wet thud that echoed off the church walls. Sina stood alone on the edge of the cliff. She looked down, then turned to look at Elias. Elias holstered his gun. He walked to her, his legs trembling. He did not look over the edge. He looked only at her. He took her face in his hands. He was shaking. "You stopped me," he whispered. Sina covered his hands with hers. She leaned her forehead against his chest, closing her eyes. "We are not them. Elias," she whispered. "We are not them. Behind them." The townspeople stood in silence, witnessing the end of a tyrant and the survival of something far stronger than a gun. The fall of Silas Caldwell did not end the winter of the town's discontent immediately, but it broke the fever that had gripped the valley. The merchant lay dead on the rocks of the ravine, his neck broken by his own malice and a patch of loose gravel. It was a grim end, but one that 50 witnesses saw clearly. There was no murder here. There was only the inevitable gravity of a man who had pushed too far. In the days that followed, the silence in the town was heavy. But it was the silence of shame, not fear. The circuit judge, Holloway, did not leave immediately. He set up court in the church, the only building with enough dignity left to hold the law. Elias and Sina stood before him 3 days after the incident. The room was packed, but the mood had shifted. The sneers were gone. In their place was a quiet, uncomfortable curiosity. They looked at Sina, really looked at her, and saw not the caricature Caldwell had painted, but the woman who had stood on the edge of a cliff and refused to let her husband become a killer. Judge Holloway sat behind the pulpit, his spectacles catching the morning light. He adjusted his papers, the rustle loud in the stillness. "I have reviewed the evidence," the judge announced, his voice dry and sharp as old parchment. "The contract of marriage between Silas Caldwell and Sina Larsdottir is hereby declared null and void. It was an instrument of coercion, not a union of consent." He picked up the water rights document, the one that had threatened to strangle Elias's ranch. "And this," he said, holding it up with 2 fingers as if it were soiled, "this is a forgery, a clumsy one at that. The water rights remain with the land, and the land remains with Elias." The judge paused. He looked over the rims of his glasses at the crowd. He looked at the women who had pulled their skirts away from Sina, and the men who had laughed at the jokes in the saloon. "I have heard the talk in this town," the judge said quietly. "You speak of giants, you speak of monsters, but what I saw on that cliff was not a monster. I saw a woman of exceptional courage. I saw a woman who saved a man's soul when the rest of you were content to watch him hang." He looked directly at Sina. "You are free, madam, and you have the gratitude of this court." When they walked out of the church, the sunlight was blinding. The sheriff was waiting at the bottom of the steps. He took off his hat, twisting the brim in his hands. He looked at Elias, then at Sina. "I reckon I was looking the other way too long," the sheriff said, his voice gruff. "Caldwell, he cast a long shadow. He cast a shadow because you let him stand in the sun," Elias replied, his voice even. The sheriff nodded, accepting the blow. "The big cattle outfits, the ones Caldwell was treating with, they have pulled back. They don't like the smell of a grand jury. You won't be seeing their riders on your fence line anymore. If you do, you send for me. I will come." It was an olive branch, offered with a rough hand. Elias took it with a nod, but he did not smile. Trust was a currency he had little of, and he would not spend it cheaply. The victory in court secured their freedom, but it did not fix the roof. It did not bring back the dead cattle, nor did it refill the empty grain bins. The ranch was free of legal threats, but it was bleeding money. August brought a heat that cracked the earth. The debt Elias had incurred over the winter, combined with the loss of stock from the fire and the poisoning, sat heavy on his shoulders. He spent his nights at the kitchen table, moving the same few dollars around in the ledger, trying to make them stretch. One evening, the heat in the cabin was stifling. Sina was washing dishes in the basin, the water warm from the stove. Elias closed the ledger with a heavy thud. "I am going to sell the north pasture," he said. Sina stopped scrubbing. She turned slowly, her hands dripping soapy water. "The north pasture? That is the best grass. That is where the creek runs deep. It is the only land worth enough to clear the debt," Elias said, not meeting her eyes. He stood up and walked to the door, looking out at the dark silhouette of the hills. "If I sell it, we pay the feed bill. We fix the barn properly, and there will be enough left over." "Left over for what?" Sina asked, drying her hands on her apron. "For you," Elias said softly. He turned to face her. His face was tortured, the old scars pulling tight in the shadows. "This life, Sina, it is too hard. The winter will come again. The town, they tolerate us now, but they will never truly welcome us. You are young. You are strong. With that money, you could go to the city, St. Louis, maybe Chicago. You could open a shop. You could have a life where you do not have to fight for every breath." Sina stared at him. The silence stretched between them, thin and dangerous. "You want to send me away?" she asked, her voice dangerously low. "I want you to be safe," Elias pleaded. "I want you to have peace. I brought you into a war. Sina, I brought you to a house of ghosts and broken fences." Sina crossed the room in 2 long strides. She stood before him, towering in her anger. "You think I stayed because I had nowhere else to go?" she demanded. Elias flinched. "You had no money. I had legs," she shouted, the volume startling him. "I had legs to walk away. Elias, I could have walked away the night of the blizzard. I could have walked away when the barn burned. I could have walked away when Caldwell put a gun to my ribs." She grabbed his shoulders, her large hands gripping him with a force that shook him. "I did not cross the ocean to be safe. I did not survive the snow to be sent away like a child because the work is hard." She leaned down, her face inches from his. "You think you are saving me. You are insulting me. You are telling me I am not strong enough for this life. You are telling me I am a guest in your house, not a partner." "No," Elias stammered, shocked by her fury. "No, Sina, you are everything." "Then stop trying to sell our life," she cried. She released him, stepping back, her chest heaving. "We do not sell the north pasture. That is where the calves will feed. We sell the saddle silver. We sell the extra wagon. We work harder, but we do not cut off our own arm to buy a softer coat." Elias looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, a blue flame that burned hotter than any pity or fear. He realized then that he had been holding on to the last piece of his isolation, the belief that he was destined to be alone, that he was too damaged to keep anything good. He let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping. "You are a stubborn woman, Mrs. Elias." Sina smoothed her apron, her chin high. "I am a rancher's wife," she corrected, "and I do not run from winter. The town, much like the land, changed slowly. There was no parade, no sudden embrace, but the venom had been drawn out of the wound. It began with a store clerk, Mr. Dobbins. When Sina went in for flour in September, braced for the usual cold silence, he cleared his throat. "Mrs. Elias," he said, keeping his eyes on the counter, I put aside a bolt of blue wool. Came in on the train Tuesday. I thought, well, it matches your eyes, and the price is marked down." Sina looked at the fabric. It was good wool, and the price was half of what it should have been. It was an apology wrapped in commerce. "Thank you, Mr. Dobbins," she said. "I will take it." The real shift, however, came with the blood. In late October, a frantic knocking came at the cabin door in the middle of the night. It was the widow, Mrs. Halloway, a woman who had once crossed the street to avoid Sina's shadow. She was pale and trembling. "It is Sarah," she gasped, speaking of her daughter-in-law. "The baby is coming, but it is stuck. The doctor is in the next county. Please, you are strong." Elias reached for his boots, But Sina was already moving. She grabbed her coat. "I come," she said. The birth was a nightmare of heat and exhaustion. The girl, Sarah, was small and frail, and the baby was turned wrong. The room smelled of fear and copper. The local women who had gathered were panicked, wringing their hands, praying for a miracle but expecting a coffin. When Sina entered the room, she filled it. She did not shrink. She did not apologize for her size. She rolled up her sleeves, revealing those thick, powerful forearms that had lifted fence posts and broken Caldwell's grip. She moved the other women aside with a gentle but immovable authority. "Hold her legs," Sina commanded. She worked for hours. Her hands, so often called monstrous, became instruments of impossible delicacy. She used her strength not to force, but to hold. When the girl thrashed in agony, Sina held her steady as a rock. When the baby needed to be turned, Sina's large hands encompassed the infant, guiding it with a precision that belied her size. When the baby finally cried, a thin, squalling protest against the world, the room collapsed in relief. Sina washed the child and handed him to his mother. She stood back, wiping sweat from her brow, suddenly aware of her intrusion, suddenly feeling huge and clumsy in this room of mothers. She turned to leave. Wait, it was the widow Holloway. She walked up to Sina. She looked at the giant woman, then reached out and took Sina's hand, the hand that was twice the size of her own. "You have hands like a cradle," the widow whispered. "God bless you." After that night, the whispers changed. Sina was no longer the freak. She was the one you sent for when the wagon was stuck in the mud. She was the one you called when a husband broke his leg and the hay needed hauling. She was the one who could stand in the door when trouble came, and trouble would turn around and leave. The children felt it first. They stopped running when she walked down the boardwalk. A little girl, brave and curious, approached her outside the post office one day. "Are you a giant?" the child asked. Sina knelt down in the dust, bringing her face level with the girl. "No, little one." She smiled. "I am just deep, like a river." The ranch healed. It was not the healing of magic, but the healing of scar tissue, tougher than the skin that was there before. They rebuilt the barn wall with green lumber that smelled of pine pitch. They dug the water troughs deeper. The garden Sina had planted struggled in the harsh wind, but the potatoes grew deep and sweet, and the carrots pulled from the earth were orange gold. The spruce tree, the little saplings she had planted in the mud of their despair, had taken root. It had grown perhaps 2 inches, a stubborn finger of green pointing at the gray sky. Elias and Sina walked the land in the evenings. They talked. They talked of Leo, the boy who died, keeping his memory alive so he would not just be another casualty of the West. They talked of Norway, of the ocean Elias had never seen. "Tell me about the water," Elias would ask. "It is like the prairie," Sina would say, "but it moves, and it breathes, and it tastes of salt tears." They talked of the violence Elias had carried. He told her about the faces of the men he had killed, the nightmares that used to wake him, and in the telling, the ghosts lost their power. They were no longer demons haunting him. They were just sad, dead things that belonged to a past he no longer lived in. Winter circled back around. The wind began to bite with familiar teeth. The sky turned the color of bruised iron. It was Christmas Eve again. The snow began in the afternoon, soft flakes that drifted rather than stung. It was a gentle snow, a blanket rather than a shroud. Sina was in the barn, checking the new calf, a strong, healthy bull that promised a good spring. She finished her work, blowing out the lantern, and walked back to the cabin. The snow was already ankle deep. She trudged through it, her boots heavy with mud and slush. She was tired in a way that felt good, the ache of muscles used for a purpose. She reached the porch and kicked her boots against the post. She opened the door with her hip, carrying a bucket of milk. The warmth of the cabin rushed out to meet her, smelling of roasting venison and pine boughs. She shook her skirts, sending a spray of white powder across the floorboards. The wind tried to push the door inward, a playful gust, and she laughed, leaning her weight against it to latch it shut. "Safe," she murmured. She did not hear Elias move. He had been sitting by the fire, but he stepped up behind her as she set the bucket down. He wrapped his arms around her waist. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his beard scratching softly against her skin. He felt the cold radiating from her coat and the heat of her body beneath it. She leaned back into him. Closing her eyes, she felt the solid wall of his chest, the strength of his arms. Elias tightened his hold, resting his chin on her shoulder. He looked down at her boots, wet and muddy. Standing on the floor he had built. "What is between your legs now?" "Mrs. Elias," he whispered. The question hung in the warm air, a ghost of the first thing he had ever said to her. Stripped of its fear, stripped of its shock, it was a teasing echo, a secret joke that belonged only to them. Sina smiled. She turned in his arms, looking down at him. Her eyes were the color of the deep fjord ice, but they were warm with firelight. She did not blush this time. She did not look away. "Between my legs?" she answered softly, her hand coming up to cup his scarred cheek. "Between my legs are the steps that carried me to you, and the strength to stand beside you. The simple poetry of it, the absolute truth of it, hit Elias harder than any blow. His throat tightened. His eyes stung with sudden, hot tears. He looked at this woman, this tower of strength who had crossed an ocean, survived a blizzard, and faced down a gun for him. He did not speak. He could not. He pulled her closer, crushing the distance between them until there was no air left. Only the two of them fused together. They moved to the hearth. The fire was low, a bed of glowing coals. They did not rush. There was no desperate hunger to prove anything. They knew each other now. Elias knew the map of her scars as well as he knew his own land. Sina knew the rhythm of his breath as well as the tides. When they kissed, it was deep and slow. It was a conversation without words. It was an acknowledgement of every cold night they had survived to reach this warmth. They lay in the bed that was no longer too small, for they had learned how to fit together. The wind whispered outside, but it could not touch them. The lovemaking was fierce and tender, a reclaiming of their bodies from the pain of the past. It was not about mechanics. It was about the way Elias whispered her name like a prayer, and the way Sina held him as if he were the anchor that kept her from floating away. Later, the fire had burned down to embers. The room was dark, save for the faint blue light of the snow reflecting through the window. Sina lay with her head on Elias's chest. She listened to the steady, strong beat of his heart. Thump, 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 thump. It was the sound of her home. Elias traced patterns on her arm with his calloused fingertips. "I had a dream," he said quietly, his voice rumbling in his chest. "Tell me," she murmured. "I saw the spruce tree. It was tall, taller than the cabin. And I saw a house, bigger than this one, with a porch that wraps all the way around. And I saw children." He paused, running, between the barn and the tree. "They had your hair, and my eyes. And they were not afraid. No one questioned them. They stood on this land like they grew out of it." Sina went still. She lifted her head, propping her chin on his chest to look at his face in the shadows. "Children?" she asked. Elias smiled crookedly. "A man can dream." Sina took his hand. She guided it down, past her waist, resting it flat against her stomach. Her belly was soft, warm under the flannel nightshirt. "I am late. Elias," she whispered. The words hung in the air like fragile glass. Elias stopped breathing. He kept his hand still, as if moving it would break the spell. "Late?" he choked out. "The bleeding." It did not come. Hope and fear warred in his eyes. A child, in this hard land, a child with his blood, which he had thought cursed, a child with her size, which she had thought a burden. He looked at her, searching for doubt, but found only a quiet, terrifying joy. He stroked her hair, his hand trembling slightly. "A miracle," he whispered. "But if it is not?" Sina asked, the old fear of disappointment surfacing. Elias pulled her down to him, kissing her forehead. "Child or no child, Sina, Look at us. We are alive. We are here. We carved a life out of rock and ice. That is the miracle. Anything else? Anything else is just grace. Morning came with a brilliance that hurt the eyes. The storm had passed, leaving the world scoured clean and draped in white. Elias and Sina stepped out onto the porch. The air was so cold it snapped, but the sun was bright. They stood hand in hand, Elias in his sheepskin coat, Sina in her blue wool shawl. They looked out over the pasture. The fence posts cast long blue shadows across the snow. The cattle were huddled near the barn, their breath rising in steam. And there, by the corner of the cabin, stood the spruce tree. It was half buried in a drift, but the top was free. It was a defiant, vivid green against the blinding white. Sina squeezed Elias's hand. He squeezed back. They stood side by side, the scarred man and the giant bride, their shadows stretched out before them, merging into one long, unbroken shape on the snow. They were not perfect. They were not whole, but they were together. And that, they knew, was enough to weather any winter that came. Thank you for listening to What's Between Your Legs. This story of Elias and Sina was a journey through the harshest winters of the human heart, and I hope it brought a little warmth to your day. It is a reminder that sometimes the things that make us different are exactly what give us the strength to survive. I would love to hear your thoughts on their journey. Did you expect Sina to stand up to Caldwell on the cliff? And what do you think their future holds with the new baby on the way? Please, tell me in the comments. Where are you listening from today? I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this tale of the American West, please consider subscribing to From Wild West. We have many more stories of love, survival, and the grit of the frontier waiting for you. Until next time, keep your fences strong and your hearth warm.